The second part of the autonomic nervous system will look at neurotransmitter, neurohormones a little bit more in depth, and also look at the receptors for which they bind to for both the adrenergic and cholinergic neurons. Within the autonomic nervous system, particularly with the sympathetic division, we have the neural hormones of norepinephrine and epinephrine that are going to be actually produced within the adrenal medulla of the kidneys. And so with these, what they do is promote the preganglionic fibers then to secrete amounts of either norepinephrine or epinephrine under sympathetic stimulation. And so about 15% of what is released from the adrenal medulla is norepinephrine, and then about 85% of epinephrine or adrenaline is released from the adrenal medulla. And so norepinephrine and epinephrine make up a certain class of neurohormones called catecholamines. And so if we look here, all of the preganglionic fibers that we have here that stem off of the central nervous system all release acetylcholine. However, now the difference between the sympathetic and parasympathetic is what the postganglionic fiber releases. So what we have here is that in the blue, that represents acetylcholine, and that's what the parasympathetic division releases versus the norepinephrine here that we see, and that is released by the sympathetic nervous system. Tissues within the body then are going to respond to the autonomic nervous system depending on the type of receptors that they have and also with what neurotransmitter or neurohormone is released. So let's talk about the two main types. We have first cholinergic, and then the second is adrenergic. So cholinergic, these have choline, so they bind to acetylcholine. And so within that, we have two different types. We have nicotinic acetylcholine receptors and muscarinic acetylcholine receptors. So with the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, these are found in the autonomic ganglia, and they're stimulated by acetylcholine from the preganglionic neurons, okay? And so they also serve as ion channels for both sodium and potassium, and so they cause depolarization. The net effect, though, with nicotinic is that it is always excitatory. Muscarinic acetylcholine receptors are found on the visceral organs and are stimulated by the release of acetylcholine from postganglionic fibers. Okay, so what we've found is that these can affect then the cell membrane, but however, these can either be excitatory or inhibitory. Okay, so I'm going to do a plus or minus. So it depends on the tissue in terms of if that tissue becomes excited or if that tissue becomes inhibited and doesn't produce some type of reaction. Adrenergic receptors now are going to bind to norepinephrine and to epinephrine. Okay, so these are going to be part of the sympathetic division. With the difference of the adrenergic receptors, there are compounds or molecules that will bind selectively to one or the other type. And so that will either promote or inhibit some normal action due to the binding of either norepinephrine or epinephrine. So for example, for stimulation, we'll have the heart be stimulated, dilatory muscles of the iris, smooth muscles of blood vessels, causing vasoconstriction, and then some inhibitory responses would be like bronchioles in the lungs and other blood vessels, also differences in inhibition of contraction and causing dilation of these structures. So with that, there's two main types of adrenergic receptors. So we have alpha adrenergic receptors, and so alpha is going to bind to norepinephrine, and beta receptors will have epinephrine bound to it. And so typically with epinephrine, these are due to circulations within the bloodstream that then will have an effect on some type of tissue. So now if we look at different effects of adrenergic receptors, let's just take a look at the responses of different tissues. So for example, here within the eye, what we find is that it particularly binds to alpha receptors. And let's not worry about alpha 1 and 2 and beta 1 and 2. Let's just focus on alpha and beta. The heart will bind to beta receptors. And so with beta, again, that had to do with epinephrine. And so the other tissues that epinephrine also seems to affect are like the skeletal muscle vessels and arterioles here. And then we also have with the bronchioles to help them dilate. And then liver will also respond to epinephrine. However, if we look at norepinephrine, which again had to do with the alpha receptors, so the eye predominates the blood vessels within the skin. Also, we have constriction, so opposite effect here between norepinephrine and epinephrine. And then also with the stomach and intestines, helping with those to contract. And then also here we'll have dual stimulation by both hormones for the liver. So when we talk about receptors and binding, we also come across different types of agonists and antagonists. Agonists are those that bind to the same receptors as neurotransmitters, and what they do then is they mimic that same response. And so while you might have, like, for example, low circulating levels of epinephrine, then there could be another molecule that you take that has a similar effects because it binds to then those beta receptors. Antagonists, on the other hand, will bind with receptors. However, they're going to block the response of the neurotransmitter. And so what we have here is then competition between neurotransmitters that are what are called endogenous or circulating within the body, and then also those that are maybe foreign, and so that will have a maybe negative effect within the tissues. And so this table here, what it shows is that here, drugs that stimulate, this represents agonists, and then drugs that block would represent antagonists. And so here's examples of alpha adrenergic receptors that would be either have agonist and antagonist drugs. And so again, for alpha, these would either mimic or block the effects of norepinephrine. Then what we have here are examples of the beta receptors that are responding to epinephrine, and then both the muscarinic and nicotinic receptors, which would bind with acetylcholine. And so you can see some of the effects are going to be quite opposite in terms of what they do. And let's look at here, like with the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, where if you have an antagonist, then these will actually block your neuromuscular junctions for a little while. Nicotine actually is going to be an agonist. However, there are no known benefits with nicotine quite yet. So our central nervous system can also affect and influence our autonomic nervous system. And so, for example, like within the limbic system, this can aid in responses such as during emotional states, so like with blushing, fainting, cold sweating, a racing heart. Also within the frontal and temporal lobes of the brain, these will also affect the autonomic nervous system in terms of our emotions and personality. And then also the cerebellum can affect then motion sickness, nausea, sweating, and different cardiovascular changes. Well, within the spinal cord, so how that influences the autonomic nervous system is that we have the reflexes that are help to control urination, defecation, and different types of erection. And what that does is that one division, such as like the parasympathetic division, might cause, say, vasodilation, such as with erection. And then the sympathetic division then will influence ejaculation. And so all of that will be, though, influenced by our emotional state as well. The medulla oblongata, this is also responsible for autonomic control of the cardiovascular responses, respiratory responsive, and also our digestive activity. Then with the hypothalamus, this will affect the endocrine responses. And so one example is like a heart rate is increased when we're scared, and that's due to the amount of neurotransmitters that are and neurohormones that are being released. And then with our cortex, then we'll have different regions are going to be affected by both the medulla and the hypothalamus, but also we'll have the limbic system be involved as well as the different lobes. So like, for example, when you're blushing when you're embarrassed, that would be part of the sympathetic division that causes that.